Good afternoon. Thank you, Mima. Always a great pleasure to be working with our friends and partners, IGD. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As Mima mentioned, my name is Hubert Danso. I'm the CEO of Africa Investor and the chairman of the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Forum and the moderator and chair for today's session. This particular roundtable dialogue is going to feature a real process and discussion on institutional investor-public partnerships. And the dialogue is going to be led by policymakers, institutional investors, development finance leaders. And the focus is really going to be on really trying to get granular around the products and the policies and specifically the role of development finance institutions and how they can facilitate more allocations from global as well as domestic institutional investors, not only into Africa, but also into African infrastructure as an investable asset class. So we're going to commence this session. You can see that I've got a very small panel. Sorry about that. So everyone's going to get extra time. But I'm going to break this session up into the way that it's structured in the program that you should hopefully have in front of you with some opening remarks. And then there's going to be an extended investor discussion that will be focused just on our institutional asset owners that are with me on the panel. And then we're going to have our opening speakers from the African Development Bank and NEPAD come back and just give us their views on the comments that they've heard and the recommendations, and then just really talk about next steps and the way forward. And they have some very exciting things to share. I think most of us, experience in many cases conference fatigue. And it's not just conference fatigue because you go to a lot of conferences, but it's conference fatigue because you're sort of talking into a bit of a vacuum. It's as if we sort of come and share views that we sort of talk amongst ourselves, but we don't really know whether they're going to be taken up or acted on. Well, I can assure you that this is very different because today we have the African Development Bank that is playing a great leadership role and committing significant resources to really taking on board some of the recommendations that will be shared here today. So no vacuum there. And then the next thing is we always talk about, well, okay, it's great for a multilateral or a development finance institution to pursue an agenda, but where's the political and public sector leadership? And there I can assure you, once you hear from Shamir from NEPAD, he's really going to make clear that this is really linked into a heads of state supported and driven process. So, I mean, with that said, there's real and great impetus for this dialogue. I think we all know what happened at the G20 meeting where they focused on the Africa Compact and mobilizing institutional capital for long-term assets. The real issues that were thrown up by Basel III and Basel IV on the availability of project finance. And as I just mentioned, and critically, we're seeing increased continental leadership through the African Development Bank's High Five agenda, the African Union's Agenda 2063, and NEPAD's recently launched 5% initiative. I think what the sort of, the thread that ties all of that together is that they all recognize an urgent need for a new, structured and distinct special engagement and working relationship with real catalytic domestic and international institutional investors and asset owners. Who are we really talking about? Pension funds, sovereign funds, reinsurance institutions that are not necessarily the regular participants at events like this. It's a very specific community, and when we all congregate here in Washington or when we congregate in New York during the UN, it's sort of a very well-defined development community. Private sector, development finance institutions, governments. And I think what we believe is the sort of missing link is the full inclusion of the institutional investment community into that discourse, particularly when the SDGs, a number of the overall development agenda, is driven by significantly large investments into long-term assets. So I think when we move on to our panelists, we're really going to be looking at and hearing some very different perspectives and solutions. But from Africa Investors' standpoint, we really believe in the strength of data and then how that can come together with technology to meet this massive information deficit. I think when we were having our briefing session just now, the different types and natures and forms of pension funds and their rules and their criteria is quite a myriad of things that we have to negotiate just to understand if there is an opportunity or not. So we at Africa Investor have taken the initiative, I think pretty much a complementary stance to what the Africa Investment Forum is doing, and we've launched, ultimately a platform that brings together institutional investors, private equity players that have interest in infrastructure, as well as project developers, as well as the key data that underlines and informs the investment decision-making process. And that particular platform is called AI Asset X, so Africa Investor Asset Exchange. I think my colleague might just be able to give you a 60-second insight into that.
Partners and projects is the single biggest challenge for institutional investors seeking to allocate to Africa. AI Asset X is a marketplace designed to securely connect accredited institutional investors and aggregate the capital introduction and raising process for infrastructure projects, private equity funds, and investment managers working in Africa. Investors, project developers, and fund managers can simply apply for registration and are vetted by AI ratings. Once approved, they are listed on the platform and can post specific investment mandates, co-investment opportunities, projects, capital raising requirements, and immediately identify qualified partners. AI Asset X provides unique access to investable assets, investment strategies, secondaries, data rooms, research, and institutional co-investment partners.
So that's a small contribution from Africa Investor that we're launching here today. But I know that there are a number of other initiatives and ideas that a number of our panelists that are joining us will be sort of sharing in terms of their valuable insights and ideas and on sort of instruments and approaches both heads of state can take as champions of this agenda and the ADB can take to develop policies, products and instruments. So I'm now going to introduce our panelists who are the investors. So we have Ibrahim Khan, who is the CEO of FONSIS, the Senegalese Strategic Sovereign Fund. We have Gavin Wilson, who is the CEO of IFC Asset Management. Chuck Burbridge, who is the Executive Director of Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. Joshua Franzel, who is the President of the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, who represents retirement funds from across the country. Nick Fursley, who is the Director General of the World Pensions Council and a board member of the World Bank Group's Global Infrastructure Facility. And Ian Cameron, who is the COO from Washington State Investment Board.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.